The biggest problem, I think, with writing is this issue about being hands-on or hands-off. And the fact that as supervisors and as students, we constantly want our supervisors to almost take over our writing. And as supervisors, it's so easy for us to just take over. You know, it's like the little child. When I was much younger, I studied ordinary teaching, and I also did a course in Montessori teaching. And one of the people in the course was saying to me, but she gets so cross with her little boy, he won't help his sister into the car. And the Montessori lecturer said, but why are you expecting him to help his sister into the car? How much more will she learn by getting in herself? We all know this with little children. It's so irritating. They're struggling and we just want to help them. But even with us as PhD students or as supervisors, we help too much, or we want too much help, and then we never learn. I always say my father-in-law is a retired professor of commerce, and he has this student that many years, he had this person as a student 20 years ago. This person is now a world-renowned scholar in business management, but he's still sending all his papers for my father-in-law to rewrite. And I say to my father-in-law, you are getting to be an old man. One day you will die. What is going to happen to this man's career afterwards? So I mean, that's a bit extreme, but we have to take the hands off with writing and get people to work for themselves. But the problem with supervision is there's a whole lot of myths of supervision. Stories that have grown up that are not really true. And the scary thing is often even top management of universities believe these myths. So you'll get people saying, well, we don't need researcher education, we don't need to help PhD students because they're all very strong by themselves. They can help themselves. But actually it's not true. So as Monatunga in 2007 says, the myth about students is that they are always or already independent researchers. We can do it already, don't worry. And the myth about supervisors is that they are always or already effective supervisors, and that's also not true. I supervise 6 students at the moment, and I've supervised many over the years. And for some, I am the most wonderful supervisor that ever walked this earth, and for some, I am poison. Because sometimes it just doesn't gel. And there's nothing wrong with me or the student, but sometimes it doesn't gel. So you're not always effective, and you're not already effective. Just because you're a supervisor, you're not already effective. The other one fitting under that is that the student has excellent critical and creative thinking and writing skills already. The student can just copy the supervisor. And you can watch and copy, and you will learn. Perfect. You absorb, I call it the osmosis theory. You just are sitting near your supervisor and you absorb the wonderful learning. That you are an apprentice. And what I've added on, the problem is if you have this myth, it gets repeated again and again and again, because you say, well, I had that when I was a PhD student, my supervisor didn't help me, so I'll do the same. And I came right, so if my student doesn't come right, then bad luck to them, they're rubbish, not me. That's a myth, it's dangerous. On the supervisor side, it's that the supervisor just has to look for the talent and take it and use it. And transmit the knowledge. He or she is the master, but the problem is it is repeated again and again. I would say my biggest irony is when I did my PhD, my supervisor thought that I was just talent that she could take and she didn't have to help me at all. And at one stage, for 8 months, I had no contact with my supervisor. No contact whatsoever. When I finally managed to phone her all the way from overseas, she said, but Michelle, I know you didn't need help, so I was concentrating on the students that did need my help. And I said, but I sent you 6 drafts of this chapter. And she said, yes, but every time you improved. So it was okay. Now, ironically, I won't mention names, my supervisor is actually a fantastic supervisor who's now well known for cohort supervision. But for me, at that time in the period, she wasn't a very good supervisor because, yes, she had other problems and so forth. But she still, for me as an individual, had that myth in her brain that I was just talent that didn't need to be developed. And I promise you, I needed help, desperately. So sometimes, as students, even, we have to explain to our supervisors that we do need help. We have to explain to them that we're maybe not as clever as they think we are. That we do need support, even if we are supposedly strong. And that's the problem for those of you who are staff and students, is you tend to have this thing, I need to be perfect or whatever. Okay, so those are the problems. Now, supervisory roles, and the research, there's quite a lot of research on supervision roles, and it says that it can be varied. There's no wrong or right attitude to supervisory roles. It's what works for the individual. So there's supervision roles that are defined by the supervisor's expectations. Some supervisors treat their students like managers. Okay, like you're managing a business. Does anyone feel your supervisor is like that? Or maybe your style is like that? Or a director? Or there's some that feel I'm a partner or a colleague. Now that can be wonderful. Again, if you're a staff member and you're being supervised by a staff member, but it can also be a bad thing. I had a colleague who I supervised for many. She's just finished her PhD and she said to me, Michelle, stop being my colleague. We will set aside this time, this place, and now you are my supervisor, you are not my colleague. Stop asking me for advice, stop doing that, just focus on my project. So she managed me very well. Okay, then we have responsive roles, master, mentor, supporter, nurturer, friend. So, at this point, those of you who are supervisors, think which one of those are you? And those of you who are students, think which one of those do you want at this time? And think why. What do you think? Which one do you want?
The supporter.
You want a supporter.
Yes.
Okay, so you want to do the work and you want your supervisor to say, yay, good, come. Okay. But what can be the danger of that role?
Can I say something?
Yes.
Because my tip was, if I said I want to be a supporter, I want to be a supporter. Because like I was saying like this, normally like now, I'll do all the research and everything about that.
Yes.
Then after that, I'll submit to my supervisor.
Yes.
Then my supervisor will come and say, you know what, like you say last week, I didn't expect this from you, but this one and hit you this one,
Yes.
but not this one.
Yes.
Why you correct this one?
Yes.
Then at least I know I can be able to do it on my own. Then I can be able to
So you feel you don't want your supervisor to direct you because you will feel too restricted. You want to do the work yourself, think for yourself, but be supported.
Yes, be
Okay.
independent.
Be independent. Okay.
I agree.
But you can take it too far. Your supervisor could take the supporter role too far, and they could actually be enabling bad writing, because they could be trying to support you emotionally and whatever, and say, no, that's good. I know I've done this sometimes. Maybe the writing is very bad, and there's hundreds of things wrong. So then I'll focus on the few things that are good, and say to the student, no, that's good. And then I'll start with one of the mistakes. And I've had students come back to me later and be very upset and say, but Michelle, you said earlier, you said that was okay. Now you're saying this is terrible. I said, yes, well, I was concentrating on one mistake at a time. So that can be the danger of being the supporter. Okay, how about you at the back, the lady in the middle? What do you want to be, or what are you at the moment?
To be quite honest, I want to say I'm a mentor role, because I really think that I see a mentor as explaining to the student why I say supervision, so that they can get the principle to follow up on it, because otherwise they never learn. But there are times that you have to be the other roles as well. I always start my discussion with how are you personally, because if you can't get that out of the way and find out where the student is now, then I mean, your mentoring just goes out the window. And sometimes you've got to be the master also cracking the whip and say, hey, I haven't heard of you, so I'd like to see something on the table, thank you. So I mean, there's different.
And you're moving around in these different roles. Yes, I mean, I also always prefer the mentor role, but I've recently had another staff member who's also a colleague, but this person just doesn't get on with things. And eventually I had to say, well, I play the role that I do with the most new student from another country that I've never met before, the strict at the beginning director, and suddenly she started doing better because she needed it at that stage. I was trying to be the mentor and she wasn't ready for that. Even though she was ready as a lecturer, she wasn't ready as a PhD student. Which is the problem, is we have all these roles and it sometimes can be a bit confusing. Okay, so irrespective of the role, all of us can have poor writing pedagogy. And maybe even though you adore your supervisor today, if you're a student, he or she might be having poor writing pedagogy at the moment. And I see the two things that are poor writing pedagogy are the one, you expect the perfect document. Immediately perfect, even at the draft stage. As I say, over the years I've helped many students from many different disciplines. And one student I remember, I don't know if you know the grammatical term, a split infinitive. It's not even seen as a grammar error so much anymore. This supervisor phones me and said, this student's English is shocking, you need to fix his English. And I had looked through this proposal and it was one of the best proposals I had ever seen in my life. The student was quadruply bilingual. He could speak 4 languages fluently. He was the most brilliant man I've ever met. And he wrote such a good proposal. And I said to the student, I'm sorry, I'm very stupid, but what is wrong with the student's writing? No, he is splitting infinitives. So he was that extreme. Now that's very extreme, but some supervisors expect that. The well-crafted documents even at the draft stage. And some of us as students expect that. We keep our writing to ourselves. We don't want to give it to our supervisor. We're hiding it in our cupboard because it's not perfect enough yet. And staff are the worst at that. Because we don't want to lose face in front of our colleagues. Not a good idea. We have to. I have a friend who finally got her PhD at 65, and she had published masses of papers. She's actually well renowned in my field, but she just wouldn't hand in because she was so worried that it's got to be perfect. And I said, do you want to be in the retirement home? Hand it in, okay? So you need to be tough with yourself in the sense of it's never going to be perfect. I said to the people yesterday, the document is never perfect, and sometimes we hold it back. So what we want is higher than level 1 editing. As I was saying to people yesterday, level 1 is the polished editing. Level 2 is still some mistakes, and level 3 is many mistakes. Now the important thing as a supervisor and as a student working with your writing is don't hand in level 3 riddled with mistake documents, rather than go back to showing mind maps, dot points, talking through, if you're still at that stage. If you're at a level 2 stage, where you've got quite a few mistakes, but the document is starting to come together, then make sure that your reader knows what they're looking at. And we'll see some paperwork in that relation a little bit later. If it's level 1, don't expect it to be higher than level 1, because even level 1 is going to have some mistakes. And again, we're going to look at some paperwork in relation to that a little bit later. But if you think, I've done quite a lot of self-editing work, I've checked it many times, then tell them, I think this is a final draft. And then sometimes as a student you've got to expect to be disappointed, because sometimes, like that student, you think you've given in the perfect draft and your supervisor will still come back with corrections and still say maybe it needs a lot more work. And that's why it's much more than black and white. Spiller et al. Talk about a conversations pedagogy in supervision. It's not like teaching, where you're teaching and imparting and people are taking in the knowledge. Writing, particularly, is developed through conversation. And it's often hard conversations, critical conversations. And we've got to get over the ego of feeling hurt and pain. We have to realize and say to our students, look, I'm going to be constantly criticizing you. It's not because I don't think you're fantastic, but this is how we learn and develop. Okay, but then we have the opposite. The student, the supervisor who doesn't give the corrections to the student, but just goes and fixes it all for the students. Okay, and there we have Cadman and Cargill talk about supervisors unreflectively and routinely correcting errors and inserting their preferred form of words into the candidate's text in order to ensure a nicely expressed written document. So they just take and use track changes. Now, come on, admit it. Who of you as students actually like this, getting the track changes? And who of you as supervisors do it? Who uses track changes? Come on, admit it. Or you like getting it? Yes, I have one student in particular, and I find myself almost at pains to hold my hands off because I'm starting to change his words and change. Okay, right. So both of those are equally bad. Anthony Pare, who P-A-R-E, is a famous writing instructor. He says, and that's why I got the hands off, he says supervisors must sit on their hands. Okay, literally sit on their hands so they're not going to the computer to write. And he literally does with sentences, is he says to the student, okay, you've written it like that, and it's long, complicated, clumsy, horrible, grammar errors or whatever. And he says, how else could you say it? Give me 3 other ways in which you could write that sentence. And then it's very interesting when you start to look for alternatives. And as a writer, you also need to do that for yourself. Okay, you've written it and you think it's lovely. My one particular student who I want to correct all the time, he has a very fancy vocabulary. And he writes, fancy sentences, but they are terrible. And I have to say, okay, tell me 3 other ways you could say it. No, there's no other way. This is the perfect way. And I force him, and I force him, and I force him. And eventually he comes up with a much clearer way of saying it. So do that to yourself. How many other ways can you say things?